I used to think life was a checklist. Every box ticked meant a day less likely to fall apart. That belief lasted until the day my wife called me for the last time, and my entire life became one long series of unchecked boxes. My name is Dean Calix, and I'm a senior operations manager at Midwest Manufacturing Solutions, where contingency plans and backup files are my religion. At least, they were until I learned that some disasters can't be planned for. The irony wasn't lost on me that morning when my neighbor, old Mr. Henderson from 4B, stopped me in the hallway with his usual concerned expression. "It was very loud at your place yesterday," he said, adjusting his thick glasses. "I heard screaming." I paused, my coffee mug halfway to my lips. "No one was home yesterday," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Lana and I were both at work until 8. Henderson's weathered face creased into deeper lines. "Well, that's strange. Around 3 in the afternoon, someone was definitely making noise up there. Sounded like people arguing. Loudly." I thanked him and made a mental note of the time. 3 in the afternoon. Lana had texted me at 2:45 saying she was stuck in back-to-back patient consultations at the clinic. I remembered because I'd been in a budget meeting, watching the clock tick toward our quarterly review deadline. That conversation with Henderson planted a seed that grew into something darker over the next 24 hours. You see, when you spend your days creating contingency plans for manufacturing processes, you develop a particular kind of paranoia. Every variable matters. Every anomaly demands investigation. The next morning, I followed my usual routine. Kissed Lana goodbye at 7:30, grabbed my briefcase, and headed for the parking garage. But instead of driving to the office, I circled the block twice, parked 3 streets over, and slipped back into our building through the service entrance. The maintenance crew knew me well enough not to question my presence. I took the stairs to avoid the elevator's security camera, used my emergency key to enter through the back door of our apartment, and immediately switched my phone to airplane mode. The silence in our home felt different somehow, charged with possibility and dread. From my home office, I retrieved the voice recorder I'd bought for work presentations and placed it carefully under our bed, securing it to the frame with electrical tape. A spare security camera, still in its box from a project I'd never finished, went into the bedroom closet with a clear view of the room. I tested both devices, synchronized their timestamps with my watch, and settled in to wait. The hardest part wasn't the waiting itself, it was maintaining absolute silence while my mind raced through every possible scenario. I'd positioned myself in the guest room closet with a clear view of the hallway, my laptop open to monitor the camera feed. Hours crawled by like days. At 2:47 p.m., I heard the distinctive sound of our front door lock disengaging. Lana's footsteps echoed through the apartment, familiar and yet somehow foreign in this context. I held my breath and checked the timestamp on my recording devices. But then came other footsteps. Heavier. Male. When I heard my brother Hale's voice saying my name in my bedroom, every muscle in my body tensed. "Dean won't be home for hours," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. He's probably still buried in those spreadsheets of his. I forced myself to remain motionless, letting the devices capture everything while I documented timestamps in a small notebook. The next 30 minutes felt like an eternity, filled with sounds I'd rather forget and conversations that revealed the depth of their deception. What struck me most wasn't the betrayal itself, though that cut deep enough, but the casual way they discussed me, like I was some obstacle to be managed rather than a husband and brother who'd trusted them both completely. When they finally left, I waited another hour before emerging from my hiding spot. My hands shook as I retrieved the recording devices, but my mind was already shifting into the analytical mode that had served me well in crisis management at work. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Clear audio, time-stamped video, and my detailed notes created an unassailable record of what had happened. But more importantly, I'd captured something else. Hale entering the security code for our building's resident access system, a code he shouldn't have known. That evening, I acted normally. Lana greeted me with the same kiss she'd given me every day for 8 years, asked about my day, and shared stories from her shift at the medical clinic. I responded with my usual questions about her patients and her plans for the weekend. Neither of us mentioned the afternoon's events, but for very different reasons. My first move was purely administrative, the kind of methodical approach that had made me successful in operations management. I uploaded all files to a secure cloud storage service, had the timestamps notarized at a 24-hour legal service, and sent copies to my attorney with a detailed summary of events. I also forwarded everything to our building manager, citing unauthorized access and misuse of resident privileges. By morning, I'd scheduled a locksmith for an emergency rekeying of our apartment. Lana and Hale's response was swift but poorly coordinated. That night, Lana attempted to access our home router to delete what she assumed might be digital evidence. She claimed to the building manager that she'd made a false alarm report about a break-in, trying to explain away any security concerns. Hale took a more direct approach, sending me a series of increasingly threatening text messages about family loyalty and keeping private matters private. His messages revealed more desperation than strategy. Their countermoves failed spectacularly. The footage was already mirrored across multiple secure platforms, and the access logs had been filed with both building management and my attorney. You can't delete evidence that was never stored locally in the first place. My response was surgical and immediate. The locksmith arrived at 8 a.m. sharp, installing new high-security locks and changing all access codes. I used my authority as the primary leaseholder to revoke Hale's guest access privileges to the building. Most satisfying of all, I contacted the family business where Hale worked, a company that had given him building access credentials for legitimate maintenance work, and reported his misuse of those credentials. By noon, Lana found herself locked out of our apartment with her belongings waiting in the hallway. The HOA had issued fines for unauthorized access and disturbance complaints. Hale was suspended pending an investigation into credential abuse, and I had filed for divorce, citing adultery and criminal trespass, with video evidence to support both claims. The speed of it all seemed to catch them off guard. They'd expected confrontation, tears, maybe even violence. Instead, they got paperwork, legal consequences, and the kind of methodical dismantling that happens when someone with my skill set decides to treat personal betrayal like a professional problem. But that was just the beginning. What they didn't understand yet was that I'd been planning for this possibility much longer than they realized. You see, 3 years ago, my supervisor at Midwest Manufacturing went through a devastating divorce. His wife had cleaned out their joint accounts, sold property without his knowledge, and left him financially ruined while she moved in with her personal trainer. Watching him struggle to rebuild his life had taught me valuable lessons about protecting assets and preparing for the unthinkable. I'd started making subtle changes to our financial arrangements almost immediately after witnessing his ordeal. Small things at first, redirecting my bonuses to a separate account, investing in assets solely under my name, building a financial foundation that existed independently of our marriage. It wasn't that I didn't trust Lana then, it was simply good risk management, the same kind of thinking that made me excellent at my job. Every system needs redundancies. Every plan needs a backup. Now, sitting in my new apartment across town, I realized those preparations had been more prescient than I'd imagined. The evidence I'd gathered was just the opening move in what would become a much longer game. Lana had underestimated me, assuming that 8 years of marriage had made me soft and predictable. Hale had made the same mistake, thinking that family loyalty would protect him from consequences. They were both about to learn that the same methodical thinking that had built my career could be applied to much more personal problems. And unlike the manufacturing processes I optimized for a living, this particular system was designed to run exactly once, with no possibility of revision or repair. The plan that would define the rest of our lives had already begun. The thing about revenge is that most people do it wrong. They get emotional, make grand gestures, leave evidence everywhere. They want their targets to know exactly who's destroying their lives and why. But I'd spent 15 years in operations management learning that the most effective changes happen gradually, systematically, and often without the affected parties realizing what's happening until it's far too late to stop. My campaign against Lana and Hale began with research. I treated it like any other project, complete with timelines, objectives, and measurable outcomes. The difference was that instead of optimizing production efficiency, I was optimizing their misery. Hale was the easier target. His entire career depended on a network of family connections and personal relationships within the local construction and maintenance industry. He'd never developed skills that could transfer to other fields, never built a reputation based on merit alone. Remove those connections, and he'd have nothing left but his high school diploma and an increasingly desperate need for employment. I started with his current job. The family business that employed him, Henderson and Sons Maintenance, had contracts with dozens of residential and commercial properties throughout the city. Hale's credential abuse at my building was just the beginning of what I could prove with the right investigation. I spent my evenings reviewing public records, cross-referencing property management databases, and building a comprehensive picture of every building where Hale had access. Then I started making calls. Hello, this is Dean Calix from Midwest Manufacturing. We're conducting a security audit of our vendor relationships, and I wanted to verify some access logs for one of your employees, Hale Trenwick. The conversations were always polite, professional, and devastating. I never accused Hale of anything directly. I simply asked questions that prompted building managers to review their own security footage, check their access logs, and notice patterns they'd previously ignored. Hale had been sloppy for years. Late-night entries to buildings where he had no scheduled work, extended stays in residential areas where maintenance should have taken minutes, security cameras captured him in places he shouldn't have been, at times that couldn't be explained by legitimate business. Within 2 weeks, Henderson and Sons had lost 3 major contracts. Within a month, they'd terminated Hale's employment. The family connections that had protected him for years suddenly became liabilities as his reputation spread through the tight-knit local industry. But I wasn't finished with him. Using my professional network, I reached out to HR departments at every major employer in the region. Not to badmouth Hale directly, that would have been unprofessional and potentially actionable. Instead, I simply shared security concerns that had come to my attention during routine vendor audits. I'm not saying he's dishonest, I'd explain carefully, but given the sensitive nature of building access and the liability issues involved, I thought you should be aware of the pattern we documented. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. HR departments hate liability. They hate patterns even more. Hale found himself rejected for positions he was qualified for, often without explanation. When he did manage to get interviews, background checks revealed the security incidents that had cost him his previous job. Within 6 months, my brother was working at a discount retail store, earning less in a week than he'd previously made in a day. He'd applied for dozens of positions in his field and been rejected for all of them. The family connections that had defined his career were now actively working against him as former colleagues distanced themselves from his tainted reputation. The beautiful part was that he never knew I was behind it. To Hale, it looked like a series of unfortunate coincidences and bad luck. He had no idea that every rejection, every lost opportunity, every closed door was the result of careful planning and systematic execution. Lana presented a different kind of challenge. Her career as a medical clinic administrator was built on professional credentials and personal relationships with patients and colleagues. I couldn't attack her reputation directly without risking legal consequences, but I could make her personal life increasingly complicated and expensive. The divorce proceedings were just the beginning. My attorney, chosen specifically for his reputation for aggressive tactics, filed motions that required Lana to account for every dollar she'd spent over the past 3 years. We demanded financial records, questioned every purchase, and forced her to hire her own legal representation to respond to our increasingly complex requests. Legal fees mounted quickly. Lana's salary, while decent, wasn't designed to support extended litigation against someone with my resources and planning. I'd been preparing for this financial battle for years, setting aside money and assets specifically for legal expenses. She was fighting with whatever she could scrape together from her current income, but the real pressure came from the lifestyle changes I'd forced on her. Our apartment had been in my name, with her as an authorized resident. When I revoked that authorization and changed the locks, she'd had to find new housing immediately. The only places she could afford on short notice were significantly worse than what she'd grown accustomed to during our marriage. I made sure her new living situation was as uncomfortable as possible. Using public records and rental databases, I identified the properties she was considering and reached out to landlords with concerns about her reliability as a tenant. I never lied, but I shared information about the ongoing legal proceedings, the financial disputes, and the character issues that had led to our separation. Most landlords decided she was too much of a risk. The few who were willing to rent to her charged higher deposits and offered less desirable units. Lana found herself living in a cramped studio apartment in a questionable neighborhood, paying more rent than she could afford while legal bills consumed the rest of her income. The social isolation was equally effective. Our mutual friends had to choose sides, and I made sure they understood exactly what Lana had done and how it had affected me. I shared the evidence selectively, just enough to ensure that anyone who might have supported her knew the full extent of her betrayal. Her family was more complicated. Lana's entitled cousin Jennifer had always disliked me, viewing me as beneath Lana's social standing. Jennifer's immediate response was to rally support for Lana and paint me as the villain in their family narrative. But Jennifer hadn't seen the evidence. When my attorney shared selected portions of the recordings and video footage during discovery, even Lana's most ardent supporters had to confront the reality of what she'd done. The casual way she'd discussed our marriage, the length of time the affair had been going on, the complete lack of remorse she'd shown, it all painted a picture that was difficult to defend. Jennifer's support became a liability rather than an asset. Her loud public defense of Lana's actions made both of them look worse as more details emerged. Other family members began distancing themselves from the drama, leaving Lana increasingly isolated just when she needed support most. The systematic destruction of their lives took almost a year to fully implement, but the results exceeded my expectations. Hale went from a comfortable middle-class lifestyle to working retail and living in a shared apartment with 3 roommates. His reputation in the construction industry was permanently damaged, and his family connections had become sources of shame rather than opportunity. Lana's life had contracted to a series of daily struggles. Work, legal meetings, and her cramped apartment comprised her entire world. The social circle we'd shared during our marriage had largely abandoned her. Her family relationships were strained by the ongoing drama, and the financial pressure was constant and unrelenting. But what satisfied me most wasn't their material losses. It was watching them realize that their actions had consequences they'd never considered. They'd betrayed my trust casually, assuming I'd either never find out or be too weak to respond effectively. Instead, they'd discovered that the same analytical skills that made me successful professionally could be applied to personal destruction with devastating efficiency. The plan was working exactly as designed. Every variable had been considered, every contingency prepared for. They were trapped in a system of consequences that grew tighter with each passing month, and there was nothing they could do to escape it. But I wasn't finished yet. The foundation of their destruction was complete, but the final phase would require patience, precision, and one more carefully orchestrated revelation that would complete their ruin permanently. 18 months after that conversation with Mr. Henderson, I sat in my new apartment reviewing the final reports from my private investigator. The systematic destruction of Lana and Hale's lives had proceeded exactly according to plan, but the investigation had uncovered something I hadn't expected, something that would require one final, devastating move in our ongoing game. Lana's financial situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. The legal fees alone had consumed her savings and forced her to take a second job waitressing on weekends. Her studio apartment was in a building where the heat worked sporadically and the neighbors played music until 3 a.m. She'd lost weight, developed stress-related health issues, and aged visibly under the constant pressure. Hale's descent had been even more dramatic. After losing his retail job for excessive absences, apparently he'd started drinking heavily, he'd taken work as a mascot for a local restaurant chain. The same man who'd once bragged about his connections and his bright future now spent his days dressed as a cartoon chicken, waving at children outside fast food establishments. The private investigators' reports documented their decline with clinical precision. Financial records, employment history, social media activity, even grocery store purchases. Everything painted a picture of 2 people whose lives had been systematically dismantled by forces they didn't understand and couldn't fight. But the investigation had also revealed something else. Hidden in Lana's old medical records, discovered through a contact at her former clinic, was information about a pregnancy early in our marriage that she'd never told me about. The timing was significant. It coincided with a period when I'd been traveling frequently for work, leaving her alone for weeks at a time. More importantly, it coincided with the beginning of her relationship with Hale. The pregnancy had ended in miscarriage, according to the records, but the dates suggested possibilities I'd never considered. Had there been other affairs? Other deceptions? The foundation of our entire marriage suddenly seemed even more questionable than I'd realized. I spent weeks researching, cross-referencing dates and events, building a timeline of Lana's activities during those early years. What I discovered was a pattern of deception that went far deeper than the affair I'd documented. Credit card records showed unexplained expenses. Phone records revealed calls to numbers I didn't recognize. Even our joint tax returns contained discrepancies I'd never noticed. The woman I'd married, the relationship I'd thought I understood, had been built on lies from the very beginning. I'd been so focused on the recent betrayal that I'd missed the larger pattern of manipulation and dishonesty that had defined our entire life together. This revelation required a different kind of response. The systematic destruction I'd already implemented was satisfying, but it wasn't complete. Lana and Hale still had each other, still had their shared secret, still had the comfort of believing their betrayal was justified by love or passion or whatever story they'd told themselves. That comfort needed to be destroyed as thoroughly as everything else. I arranged to meet Lana at a coffee shop near her apartment, ostensibly to discuss finalizing our divorce. She arrived looking exhausted, wearing clothes that had seen better days, her once perfect appearance now showing the strain of the past year and a half. "Dean," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "thank you for agreeing to meet. I know things have been difficult." I studied her face, looking for traces of the woman I'd once loved. The stress had aged her, but there was something else. A hardness around her eyes that suggested the experience had changed her as much as it had changed me. "I've been thinking about our marriage," I said carefully, "about when things really started to go wrong." She shifted uncomfortably. "I know you're angry about Hale, but—" "I'm not talking about Hale," I interrupted. "I'm talking about the pregnancy you never told me about, the one from 7 years ago." The color drained from her face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, but something in my expression must have convinced her that denial was pointless. "How did you find out about that?" she whispered. "The same way I found out about everything else," I replied, "by paying attention to details and asking the right questions. The question now is whether you're finally ready to tell me the truth about our marriage, or if you want to keep pretending that Hale was your first betrayal." What followed was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. Lana confessed to affairs I'd never suspected, financial deceptions I'd never discovered, and a level of ongoing dishonesty that made our entire relationship seem like an elaborate fraud. The pregnancy, she finally admitted, might not have been mine. She'd been seeing someone else during that period, not Hale, but a doctor from her clinic who'd since moved to another state. The miscarriage had been traumatic, but also convenient, eliminating the need to explain paternity questions she couldn't answer. "I loved you," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I was young and scared, and I made terrible choices. And once I started lying, I couldn't figure out how to stop." I listened to her confession with the same analytical detachment I'd applied to everything else in this process. Each revelation was another data point, another piece of evidence that confirmed what I'd already concluded. Our marriage had been built on a foundation of deception that made any attempt at reconciliation impossible. When she finished talking, I shared what I'd learned from my investigation. The systematic way I'd destroyed her life and Hale's, the careful planning that had gone into every setback they'd experienced, the network of professional contacts I'd used to ensure they'd never recover from the consequences of their actions. "You did all of this?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Every bit of it," I confirmed. The job losses, the housing problems, the social isolation, the financial pressure, all of it was planned and executed with the same attention to detail I bring to every project. She stared at me like she was seeing a stranger. "I don't even recognize you anymore." "That makes two of us," I replied. "The man you married was naive enough to trust people who didn't deserve it. The man sitting here now understands that some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive or forget." I left her sitting in that coffee shop, finally understanding the full scope of what had happened to her life and why. The systematic destruction had been complete, but more importantly, the illusion of love or passion that had sustained her relationship with Hale was about to be shattered as thoroughly as everything else. Because my final move wasn't aimed at her, it was aimed at him. The next morning, I sent Hale a comprehensive package containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered about Lana's other affairs, her financial deceptions, and her pattern of dishonesty throughout our marriage. I included copies of her confession from our coffee shop meeting, along with a detailed timeline showing that he'd been just one of several men she'd been seeing over the years. The message was simple. You destroyed your life for someone who was never faithful to anyone, including you. Enjoy your chicken costume. Within a week, Hale had confronted Lana about the information I'd shared. Their relationship, already strained by the pressure I'd applied to both of their lives, couldn't survive the revelation that their great love affair was just another lie in Lana's long history of deception. They turned on each other with the same viciousness they'd once directed at me. Hale accused Lana of manipulating him into destroying his relationship with his family. Lana accused Hale of being weak and gullible, of believing what he wanted to believe rather than seeing who she really was. Their mutual destruction was swift and complete. Within a month, they weren't speaking. Within 2 months, Hale had moved to another city, apparently hoping to start over somewhere his reputation hadn't preceded him. Lana was left entirely alone, with no family support, no romantic relationship, and no hope of rebuilding what she'd lost. The plan that had consumed nearly 2 years of my life was finally complete. Every objective had been achieved, every variable accounted for, every contingency successfully managed. Lana and Hale had been systematically destroyed, their lives reduced to struggling for basic survival while dealing with the psychological trauma of understanding exactly how and why it had happened. But completion brought an unexpected emptiness. The analytical satisfaction of a perfectly executed plan couldn't fill the void left by the destruction of everything I'd once believed about my life and relationships. I'd won, but victory felt hollow when measured against everything I'd lost in the process. My apartment was comfortable but sterile. My job was successful but unfulfilling. My social life was limited to professional contacts who knew nothing about the personal war I'd been fighting. The methodical destruction of my enemies had also destroyed the man I'd been before their betrayal. I'd become someone I didn't entirely recognize, colder, more calculating, less capable of trust or genuine connection. The skills that had made my revenge possible had also made me into someone who might never be capable of normal relationships again. The plan that broke my marriage had also broken something essential in me, and unlike the systematic destruction I'd visited on Lana and Hale, this particular damage might be permanent. But as I sat in my apartment that final evening, reviewing the reports that documented the complete success of my campaign, I realized I didn't regret any of it. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive. Some people deserve exactly what they get. And some plans, once set in motion, have to be followed through to their logical conclusion regardless of the cost. The man I'd been was gone, but the man I'd become had accomplished something that would have been impossible for his predecessor. I'd proven that actions have consequences, that betrayal carries a price, and that methodical planning can overcome almost any obstacle. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life their choices had made necessary, and in the end, that was enough. The plan was complete, the boxes were finally checked, and for the first time in 2 years, I could close the file and move on to whatever came next.